Shalom and welcome to this edition of Revealing the Truth, where we cover the headlines, the heartlines, and biblical truth. I'm your host, Messianic Rabbi Eric Walker. Dr. Michael Heiser is a scholar in the fields of biblical studies and the ancient Near East, and is the executive director of the Awakening School of Ministry at Celebration Church in Jacksonville, Florida. He holds a PhD in Hebrew Bible and Semitic languages from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the best-selling author of The Unseen Realms, Supernatural, Angels, Demons, What the Bible Really Says About the Powers of Darkness, Reversing Hermon, The World Turned Upside Down, The Gospel According to Stranger Things, and a companion guide of Enoch, Volumes 1 and 2. In addition, he hosts the Naked Bible podcast. You can find out more about him at drmsh.com. Joining us now is the author of one of my favorite statements: if it seems odd or strange in the Bible, it must be important, is my good friend, Dr. Michael Heiser. Mike, so good to see you.
Yeah, good to see you again.
And I'm delighted that we got an advance copy of the second volume of the companion to the book of Enoch, taking us into the parables, and kind of really cements for me just how powerful the text and the imagery is in referring to the Messiah, into moving from the angelic realms, although they're mentioned, into the full grasping of this the elect one, the one we're looking for. And I had one of someone in a group said to me, you know, everybody's telling me I should read the book of Enoch. I'm a little scared. It's listed in this satanic section. And my answer to them is that, you know, not only do we have excerpts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we have other writings regarding this, it's referenced in the Bible, but everyone really, and I think it's universal, never gives a thought to that 400-year intertestamental period when you are going from Zerubbabel, and you got the two guys in the balcony of the Muppet Show saying, you know, you call that a temple? That's not a temple. Back when Solomon was around, no, that was a temple. You know,
Right.
that was, hey, don't call that a temple. And so it wasn't until Herod came along and did all this. But for 400 years, you had this huge Greco-Roman influence, and Socrates and Plato and all of the mythology of Zeus and Thor, and even as we talked about in the book of Revelation, why John used the words that he used was pointing right at Zeus. And so people are, they didn't stop reading, they didn't stop learning, they didn't stop discussing
Right.
for 400 years just because the Bible isn't set up that way. And it's kind of like this, people are caught up on gap theology in Genesis. This is the worst gap theology I've ever seen. It's a 400-year gap.
Yeah.
Nobody thought anything about God. Nobody talked about God. There was nothing written about God. And then all of a sudden, wow, thank you, Matthew, for writing the first book of the New Testament, because we've been starving for anything having to do with a messianic thought.
Yeah. You know, I can, you go into a secular bookstore, you know, they're putting in the satanic, you know, section because of later Enochian magic, you know, like Aleister Crowley stuff, which is not the book of Enoch. I mean, it ought to go in Judaism, and that's, you know, obviously what you're suggesting. And you're right. We didn't have you know, okay, it's, you know, Ezra and Nehemiah time is over, and Esther's time is over. So time out, big brain time out. You know? It's like everything goes on hold. No, you know, Enoch is one of those books that a community produced, and the community, lo and behold, believed that the Hebrew Bible was the Word of God. So let's go and look at that. And what are we going to do with all the data points of the Hebrew Bible? And so the Book of Enoch is just one of dozens of books where people are wrestling with the scriptures. That's what they had, the Hebrew Bible. Well, we've sort of totally lost that context again. And biblical writers read things, and they read these books. They were familiar with the communities that produced them, the thought patterns, the processes, and since they were Jews themselves, these things become useful. They become helpful to either think about a passage or express something about Jesus, or about the early church, or what's going on about how the new covenant is fulfilled in our day. And what's striking about Enoch, and that the parables especially get into the Messiah stuff, is that there are a number of key points that critical scholars today, basically who operate with a hermeneutic of suspicion when it comes to Messiah stuff, that you'll hear this all the time, on TV, or read it in the newsstands and the impulse shelves, always around Easter, of course, Easter and Christmas. But, this notion that the Messiah, the way Jesus is presented, that doesn't jive with the messianic profile of Judaism. Well, okay, maybe you might be right if you skip Enoch, or if you skip, some other things. But the remarkable thing about the parables and the way the book of Enoch in that section, which is chapters 37 through 71, there's a lot of Messiah talk and some key ideas like pre-existence. Okay, the pre-existence of the Messiah, which requires him to be, deity. That's in Enoch. I mean, you can find that in Enoch. So the New Testament writers weren't just making stuff up. They are representative of a trajectory within the believing Jewish community. The writer of Enoch doesn't have Jesus to sort of look at and remember, but the New Testament writers do. But the kinds of things that are being said about Messiah are consistent with what Jesus says and how he's presented in the Gospels. So it really provides a good touch point to refute the claim that the New Testament writers are just making stuff up. They're not. They're not. This stuff was around before they wrote, before Jesus even showed up. And when he does, I mean, this is one of the reasons why scholars think people in the Qumran community in particular were probably attracted to Jesus, because he's tracking with the way they were thinking about the Hebrew text. This makes sense. This is the guy, and so there are reasons for that. And you only get a glimpse of them if you read this kind of material.
In that 400 years, you've got the Aristotles and the Socrates and the Platos and the Greek mythology and the assimilation going on, because there is not a heavily structured Jewish community. There is a Sanhedrin. There's the operating, but it's not operating in its fullness. It's not operating there's more influence on intellectualism and on maintaining an identity, but also making it so that it's not in conflict with the larger oppressive kingdoms of the Seleucids or the new Roman influence. Mm-hmm. And so you're a people within a people, and you're trying to hold on to identity, but yet you still have the memory of God's instruction and Jeremiah that says, hey, go to Babylon, marry the women, get involved in their lifestyle, get involved in their idol worship, take on a new language, fit in. And so when they came back and began to restore, then there were other influences, and so the Maccabees played an important part in that, but they were not Levitical. They were farmers. They weren't able to establish a strong Jewish presence and advance even the Messianic agenda. There was great conflict. But here in the Essenes and the community at Qumran, who had rejected the Pharisaical attitudes, not the Pharisaical theology. They believed in the law. They believed in resurrection. They believed in the prophet.
They believed the Pharisees were compromisers too, on things like calendar and the associated ritual. Yeah. The people at Qumran weren't a bunch of, Berkeley or Madisonian liberals. They're not just like freewheeling it. They're real serious. They're serious about it.
And they truly want to divorce themselves because they felt that the spirituality of the relationship with God had been so compromised that people began to become followers of men, and it lost this awe, this reverence, this Solomon-esque kind of the beginning of wisdom is fear of the Lord. All of that had been watered down, and they weren't going to stand for it. So when we get to these writings out of the book of Enoch, and what do they determine? There's about 5 contributors.
Yeah, it kind of, there's still sort of an argument about that, and some, I think 5 is a good number because there are more than 5 sections, but some of the sections are so small, some scholars argue they should be appended to other, some of the other sections. But 5 major, I think that's probably a good way to put it.
As we begin to look at the parables, they're positioned as the second vision of Enoch. We talked about the first vision of Enoch in our first talk about the earlier chapters 1 through 36, and what the message was. But different from the first part, this part has told us more about the vision of heaven and a mysterious figure called the elect one. The angelic, the Gabriels and the Michaels and the Phanuels and others are not as emphasized in this, and so it becomes much more of a messianic presentation, and it's one who's more important than the angels. And this is where the emphasis comes in, is now we're starting to see a separation from this angelic influence into this much more dynamic elect one.
Yeah, Enoch, as we talked about before, just generally, the book, 108 chapters, is an apocalypse that basically says, the end is coming soon, and the righteous are going to be vindicated, the unrighteous are going to get what's coming to them. And then it explains why, and of course the answer in the first 36 chapters over and over and over again is, has to do intimately with the depravity that arose out of the circumstances of the Genesis 6 episode, the sin of the watchers. When you hit chapter 37, again through 71, the section that's called the Book of the Parables, and essentially it's because there's 3 extended parables in this section, but they don't lose sight of that, but it's not their focus, like you said. The focus here becomes on identifying the wicked, the unrighteous, and distinguishing them from the righteous, and then talking about the salvation of the righteous, which ultimately brings in the Messiah as a focus. But it'll still include reminders amid all the Messiah talk of why this is all happening. So they don't lose sight of the first 36 chapters, but it's definitely not it's not a central focus. One interesting sidebar here is in the first 36 chapters, the villains of Genesis 6 are called the Watchers. Obviously, that's very famous Enochian vocabulary. In 37 through 71, they're referred to as angels, fallen angels, or some such vocabulary like that. So that's another reason why some scholars wonder if we have a second hand, just because of the change in vocabulary there. But regardless, the two sections are tied together by that set of circumstances, again, that explain the depravity of humankind. And the solution for the righteous, anyway, is going to be the Messiah, and he's going to judge the wicked. So he takes center stage when it gets to chapter 37. There's this transition to Enoch gets you get this journey through the heavens in the first 36 chapters, and then you get to chapter 37 and onward, and Enoch is witness to this messianic figure that goes by a number of titles that are familiar to people who read the Bible, mostly the New Testament, but also the Old Testament. It's the chosen one, it's the servant, you do get Mashiach, the anointed one. The Son of Man is a big descriptive phrase. So it's very evident that we have a messianic outlook and profile given to us in these sections. And his ministry and his judgment of the unrighteous are put forth in a series of parables, again, which is why the section gets its name. But it's tied to the first 36 as well.
The parable has been consistently throughout Jewish history as one of the greatest teaching tools. I grew up with them. I know that my grandfather grew up with them. My great-grandfather grew up with them. They were a teaching method that made us think multidimensional, and you had to analyze it and be able to come at it from different angles and actually defend and argue a number of different approaches to it, which was how you learned. It wasn't just straight up, here's the text like you do in a college class, here's what I'm going to teach you, regurgitate it back to me. The parable were perspectives and open the door for discussion as to the point of view and what was the point being made, where's the emphasis and why the emphasis was being put there, where is it leading me, so that I can understand in context about what was being said about the condition of the times, but also going back, as John did in Revelation, to the early iterations, then to what was currently going on, and then into a future prediction. This follows that same pattern.
Yeah, and commentators will talk about this. It's a very familiar teaching tool. Different than allegory. I mean, allegories are just extended parables, but typically the focus point is going to be, they're pretty much straightforward. The judgment of the wicked and the advent of the Messiah, again, to judge the wicked and also to vindicate the righteous. So again, this is a familiar thing. It's not, you get parables in the Old Testament. This is not a new literary device or anything like that. And you're right, it becomes very familiar, I think, just for kind of obvious reasons. It's easier to tell the story than it is to memorize a passage and recite academic prose. It's just easier that way. You pass it down much more readily.
The non-canonization of the text of several of the intertestamental period publications tends to diminish it in the eyes of anything that the Christian world looks at, and there's also a gap in what the Jewish world, how far they're willing to go down a path that's not going to support their premise that Messiah has not come yet, or is going to be different than the anticipated deity. So they cut it off there. Christianity made their own decisions for what was God-inspired and felt that this was somewhat tainted because there were multiple contributors, or for whatever their specific decision making was. But nevertheless, if you are been studying your Bible, you are looking for supporting understanding of the transitional phase of that 400 year of assimilation, and those that did take on the Greek and the Roman lifestyle and theology, and those that maintained their Jewish identity, and what the thinking was at the time, because there was no New Testament at the time of Jesus. You know, were they in the shuk, the marketplace, saying, hey, do you think he's the one Isaiah was talking about? Or did they add the advent of, is he the one that Enoch was talking about? If they were more literate, more in pursuit, and more in this frame of mind that they were going to continue in the pursuit for the freedom of the Jews, coming out from under oppression to become sovereign as God had promised in Genesis 15, that they were going to be sovereign in a much larger land, and hopeful that they would not be under the foot of any occupier.
Yeah, I mean, the kind of conversations you describe would not be conversations that could only be had after Jesus. That just doesn't make any sense. If you're familiar with the literature, which is what you're drawing on here, you can read your Hebrew Bible, and it's going to prompt you to ask questions about, well, who is going to judge the nations? Who's going to judge the ones who are oppressing us? Who's the branch? Who's the stump of Jesse? Who's the Son of Man? Who is this figure? Who's going to be the new David? All these biblical descriptions and phrases that are quite at home in the Old Testament. They get picked up by writers in between the testamental periods, and they're trying to answer those questions, or at least sort of flesh them out, systematize the discussion, kind of direct the discussion along certain trajectories. And Enoch is part of that. And again, it's so easy to see in this book, because again, it is so clearly focused on judgment, which on one hand conforms to what scholars even today would say is the typical Jewish expectation of the Messiah. So Enoch is very much in the mainstream of that discussion. Messiah is going to come back, liberate us from our oppressors, judge the wicked, so on and so forth. But where it isn't, or at least some scholars don't want to admit it, are these other ideas like defining the Son of Man as a divine being, looping in pre-existence. Again, scholars accuse Christians of having inventive imaginations at those points. Well, I guess they're in good company then, because it's not, there isn't anything in the New Testament about the Messianic profile that you can't get from the Old Testament and that wasn't discussed earlier than Jesus, somewhere in Second Temple Judaism. And the point is not, and the point is never, what was the predominant view of Second Temple Judaism. That isn't the issue, because there's 5 or 6 Judaisms, okay? And everybody sort of knows this: Pharisees, Sadducees, people at Qumran, all these different groups. They don't all agree, lockstep in their theology, and sometimes they disagree quite a bit. But they're nevertheless using the Hebrew Bible as the point of reference for their thinking. So what the real question is somewhere in in that pool, in the Second Temple Judaism pool, do we find the precursors, the elements of later New Testament writings post-Jesus? And the answer is yes, we do. So the claim that the New Testament writers are just making stuff up, they're ignoring, the Jewish expectation of the Messiah and substituting, the old bait and switch, substituting something else, is just not coherent in light of the data. You can find all these ideas. It just kills me. This is one of the things that really irks me. In the second semester of the coursework that I'm offering in Jacksonville, second semester in the second year is going to be what I call contemporary postmodern apologetics, and the New Testament's the focus in the second semester. But this is one of the things that I'm going to focus on, because New Testament writers will all of a sudden get accused. Well, they used the Septuagint to make that messianic argument. Oh, you mean that thing translated by Jews? That thing? Look, it's the product of Jewish thought in the Second Temple period. It's not like you had a colony from Mars come in and produce the Septuagint. It's Judaism. It's Second Temple Judaism. So all of these things, are part of the Jewish thought, community. Nobody's looking at the people who, before Jesus, nobody's looking at the people who produced the Septuagint like they're morons, or they're idiots, or they're trying to do this interpretive sleight of hand. No, they're actually thinking about the text, and this is on the table as far as how you could translate it. Post Jesus, it's easy for New Testament writers to look back and look at the source material and think, wow, this dude was onto something. He was onto something. This is how he was thinking about the text, and lo and behold, like we lived this out with Jesus. It's part of the stream of Judaism. It's not contrived or anything like that. And Enoch, again, is sort of an exhibit A, of that kind of thing, when it talks about the Messiah being named, before creation. It's got to be more than a man. It's got to be more than a human son of David, to do things like that, to say things like that. So the New Testament writers, if you're familiar with this material, you can be, I think, encouraged or emboldened to realize that these criticisms levied against New Testament interpretation do not hold water. They are consistent with the Jewish mindset. One of the streams of Judaism. They're tracking with them. There was no single way of looking at the messianic profile in Second Temple Judaism. There were a variety of ways, and they were all legitimate. They were all part of the discussion. They're all on the table. It's only after you get, through the events of the Gospels and Jesus, that the one that was the most in line, the one that had it mostly correct, that only becomes visible in hindsight. You don't have to invent it. You just have to have something help you discern which trajectory was the one that, they were really onto something here.
But even in light of the earliest passages of Genesis, we read things like Kol Halak Elohim, the voice of God walking, halak always meaning two-legged. We see almost every reference, I think without exception, when we see the angel of the Lord. That's the pre-incarnate Messiah. There's an encounter with a man. Abraham had a happy meal with God, and then all of a sudden the dietary laws come in and say you can't serve milk and meat. I'm thinking if it's good enough for the pre-incarnate Jesus, and it's good enough for me, a cheeseburger and a milkshake, because that's what he made for him. But we see evidence, but for me, as you know, my story, I got thrown out because of Genesis 3:15. Mm-hmm. I got thrown out of the Orthodox synagogue because I was relentless to say that there's nowhere, by the time I come to the end of 2 Chronicles, is Genesis 3:15 addressed and fulfilled. And if that is all there is that God has had to say about the earliest prophecy, which is the most powerful of the defeat of evil in the world and the restoration of the Garden of Eden, and it is not found in this text, then where is it? And of course, I got the complete Maimonides and the complete dissertation of the Talmudic writers and the tractates on what it meant, but none of it fit. None of it fit the narrative. None of it explained it away, that the promise was made of God, the first prophecy, and it had to be fulfilled because he said it. And finally, at age 42, they threw me out. They said, we're sick of hearing this question.
Actually, you were tracking, there was something gnawing at your brain there, the splinter, in the brain, as they would say in the Matrix. It's actually very consistent within the Torah. We just had, I think the episode dropped a week ago on the Naked Bible podcast. I had Seth Postel on, who is one of the group of One for Israel. They live in Israel, Jerusalem. And Seth and two of his colleagues wrote a book called Reading Moses and Seeing Jesus. And it's really based on some of Seth's doctoral work. He did his PhD under John Sailhammer, who is sort of noteworthy within the evangelical community for arguing that the structure of the Torah itself points to the Messiah. And what he means by that, and how Seth picked up on this. And the book is really about the relationship of the believer, whether it's a Jewish believer in Yeshua or the Gentile, their relationship to the law. But the overarching argument is that, look, the Torah itself tells the story, and this is why Adam and Israel are parallel. In the Torah, you see these same things happen to one as to the other. The Torah tells the story of God seeking a relationship with man that ultimately is going to end in human failure and exile and not be resolved in the Torah. Its resolution must lie beyond the Torah. And he goes through and talks about how there are three or four places, I think it's three places where in the latter days or in the last days is used in the Torah, and they occur at real critical junctures within the Torah itself. And he talks about how Deuteronomy 32, has, Moses essentially saying, hey, here's your history in Deuteronomy 32. It's not a good one. It's just like Adam. Adam was in this perfect environment with the one law of God, and look at what happened. He ends up in exile. He gets kicked out, and you people are basically in the process of getting kicked out. You're gonna, this whole story is going to end in exile. And then presenting this notion of a prophet that's like Moses, who will not, he'll be the one that successfully guides you out of exile, and all these different themes in the Torah. And so you're tracking on the sense as a younger man of, I can kind of see how the story ends, and it doesn't end with a resolution to our problem. There's no, you would think if the story is designed to end with our salvation, either through the law or just being Jewish, that's how the story would actually end that I'm reading. But it doesn't. It just kind of leaves you in exile. And there are like Seth and other scholars would say precisely. That's the point. You have these unfulfilled promises and these unfulfilled tensions. They're awaiting something that must lie beyond the pages of the Torah and the Tanakh itself. They're pointing beyond it. So you were on that stream, a long time ago.
I was a bulldog. I mean, I was relentless, and I actually had a letter of introduction to the chief rabbis of every country I traveled to, and I would have this dialogue with them, and they would get frustrated and angry with me, and say that
I just want to know why the story ends the way it does.
Yeah, just give me when it happens. I just want to know when the seed of the woman
Right.
defeats the seed of the serpent. I mean, you got us kicked out of the garden. I understand there's a path to return. God wants us.
Yeah.
Our very name, Yehudi, worshiper of God, the origin of Jew, not Judah, but Yehudi formed into Judah. It formed into Jew. It was started out that we were all created to worship God. Yeah, I want to worship Him in victory, not in constant persecution. And you've given me no way out. I'm destroyed. 70 A.D. I've been told by Daniel that the anointed one's going to be cut off before the destruction of the Second Temple. You can't show me anybody that raised the dead, healed the sick, gave the blind sight, and delivered a man from a dumb spirit in the Tanakh. So you're making me, you're forcing me to go find the rest of the story that you're denying. And you've had 2,000 years to prove that he didn't exist. And I'm not defending him anymore. You've had 2,000 years. And your entire intent was to prove he didn't exist. And you have not come up with one irrefutable. He did not exist. Yeah. So I'm tired of defending him. All right, against you. You come up with a shred of evidence, because what I have is eyewitness testimonies. I have death followed by immediate resurrection. The graves were open. I have intertestamental writings that are telling me that there is one that's going to come, and when your sages and your writers had finished all that God had showed them, and there was no conclusion, there was only a forecast of events to come that would usher in a victory. Well, Isaiah 59, who was he looking at? The guy's spattered with blood. He claims.
Even the later rabbinic commentary about Jesus, it doesn't deny that he did these things. It just calls him a sorcerer.
Exactly. A violation of Deuteronomy 16 or 19. I forget what it is. And so he's a diviner, a sorcerer, a necromancer, and but yet, what's so interesting is he's asked a question of John, and are you the one to come, or is the one follow you? And he answers him in a particular order. And that is the same order of what I've been able to find. I have a copy of a book I need to send you. It's called The Messiah Conspiracy. All right? It was written by a friend of mine in Atlanta. It never got any traction, but it is, I don't know how many thousands of pages long, but it is The Messiah Conspiracy, and it maps out what was the full conspiracy behind it. A fascinating read. It'd take you forever. But even you'd make me feel better just having a copy of it on your shelf, and one day you'll grab it down and you read something. It might pique your interest. It's not a book you read. You know the kind of book I'm talking about. It's one you reference to.
You reference it, yeah.
But there was a messianic expectation that there would be one that could heal a man who was blind from birth. Well, how can you be blind from birth? No eyes. Well, Jesus does what his Father did. He reaches in the dirt. He spits. He creates eyes. And that's the bara. That's an act of God.
Yeah, there's even a Dead Sea Scroll that links that act, making the mud with spittle, back to the creation account. I have a little short article. I can't remember what book it's in, but again, that there's an idea in Second Temple Jewish literature that anybody who has read that text or had that discussion, they know when they see Jesus doing this, they read the account, it's like, oh, here we go. Here's another one.
Right. Here's Lazarus. Okay, he arrives on the third day. This is his best friend, best buddy. He loves Mary and Martha. And so why does he just sit there and weep and wait a day? Because Jewish theology says that knowing that the soul leaves the body after the third day, according to Jewish theology, that only God could restore a soul. David told us that in the 23rd Psalm. Right? It was a foreshadowing of this restorative act that only God can restore a soul. And so dead 4 days, he raises him from the dead. That's an act of God. Only God can do that. Then you have the healing of leprosy, the tantamount of forgiveness of sin. Only God can forgive sin. And the fourth, which is the one that confuses so many people, is that the disciples come back and say they couldn't deliver this man of a spirit. And he says, well, bring me the guy. And there was a mute, and it couldn't tell you its name. Well, in the dominion mandate given in the garden, Adam was given dominion over a thing that had a name. There's only one thing that God did not bring him to name, and that was himself. Therefore, man doesn't have dominion over God. God has dominion over man. And so this evidence of God being able to have dominion over that which has no name, right, is an attribute of God. So when Jesus answers John and says, boom, 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 here's the things that there was the expectation. The blind see, the dead were raised, the lame were healed. It goes through and specifically refutes what the messianic expectation was, and yet he wasn't a deliverer for the nation of Israel. But because he was the personal Messiah, he set me free, and he set you free. And when we look at it and we take it into the context in which he presented himself, he fulfilled every expectation.
He actually, I mean, this is the point where, again, a lot of scholars will say, well, the Jewish profile was correct. We're supposed to have, military, violent, divine warrior deliverance. And look at all this other stuff Jesus is doing. I mean, let's set aside the passages he quotes, like Isaiah 61, okay? What this is one of those points where if you were back in time at the scene, you would want to step in and say, you do err not knowing your own scriptures. Because he also has to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant, which is to bless the nations. Okay, so it's a real simple question. The Messiah is supposed to bless the nations, again, be the seed of Abraham, which will bring them back in, and he's also supposed to judge them. Which of these two things, what's the order that makes sense? Well, let's annihilate them first and then bless them. No, let's try it the other way around. Let's fulfill the Abrahamic covenant first, bless them, offer them salvation as the Messiah of the whole world, and then if they reject it, okay, well then it's time for judgment. The Messiah is supposed to do both things. And Jesus quotes from the prophets about, the servant and so on and so forth, doing what he does at Nazareth is really clever. He quotes from Isaiah 61, but he only quotes it partially. And he loops in, Isaiah, 42 and 35 and 58. He actually draws from several passages, not only in that sermon, but other parts of Luke's gospel. Jesus does this, where he'll quote the positive stuff about the Gentiles and leave the judgment material out. Like 3 or 4 times this happens. And I mean, what better way to telegraph that, okay, I've got 2 jobs here, right? This is the order in which we're going to tackle them. I'm here to be your savior and bring you back home. And later the judgment comes. You can't reverse them. Both job descriptions are in the Hebrew Bible. why is it that the Jewish community can only see one? I mean, humanly speaking, we understand why, because they are oppressed, they hate Rome. They're blinded to the passages in their own Bible that have the Messiah or portray the Messiah a different way. It's like they're not even on the radar because of their own pain. So on one level, it's understandable, but on the other level, it's just illegitimate to say that the way Jesus is presented in the Gospels has no attachment to the messianic profile of the Hebrew Bible. It does. It does. It absolutely does.
In order for him on that last day of his life to completely fulfill, as he said in Matthew 5:17, I came to fulfill the law.
Yeah.
And
fulfill the Torah.
Right.
Yeah.
To link it to John's statement of behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world,
Yeah.
he had to become the Leviticus 16 sacrifice of atonement where Rome had to lay their hands on him to transfer their sin. Israel had to lay their hands on him to transfer their sin, so that the world had only one or the other. He would only be the Messiah of Israel, the Messiah of the nations. So they both had to do it. Now he's clothed with all of our righteousness, which is filthy rags. He's led outside because he's no longer with blemish or spot. He meets that Levitical requirement that he was no longer clean.
Driven out of sacred space, out of the city. Yep.
Right. Bearing our sin, and this concept of take away is so powerful because it does not exist. Even God did not take away Adam and Eve's sin. He only covered it. So the covering was all the way through the Tanakh, was this covering of sin. So this powerful statement of a takeaway was revolutionary. This is mind-boggling. This is something that only happened once a year in Leviticus 16, and it was only for an annual renewable process.
And look at that. Simple question. Did Second Temple Jewish writers talk about the Messiah in conjunction with the Day of Atonement? Yeah, they did. Again, the New Testament writers don't need to invent anything. It's all there. So it just kills me how this, I'm just going to call it what it is, this mythology, that the way the New Testament presents Jesus is somehow out of step with the messianic portrayal in Second Temple Judaism. Okay, with some writers it is, but with other writers it's not. They're all Jews living in the Second Temple period and writing in the Second Temple period. They're not going to agree on every point, but these ideas that you find in the New Testament are one stream of Second Temple Judaism that you can find and follow. And Enoch again is part of that. This is why this whole discussion we're having here. This is why people should at least read a little bit of this material, because it will inoculate you against stupid criticisms of New Testament theology that just have no basis in reality. If for no other reason, it's good to be aware of this stuff, that the New Testament writers are not contriving and fabricating what they're saying, and their interpretations are not idiosyncratic. They're there. They're there.
But they're indelibly linked to the
Yep.
original text and the original words of God and the presence of Messiah. I'm still a big believer that Messiah entered the world when God said, "Let there be light," and the light overcame the darkness, that Satan had already fallen, and that was the angel of darkness, and that this was the dividing line and the beginning of a dividing, separating process that occurred all through. I mean, there's only 14 verses about creation, and it's all about separation. And then he goes on to separate, 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 and then we get 65 books on how to get back. But if the analysis is that there's a pathway, yes, we've broken covenant with God, but there's these pathways. We're going to try the law, and we're going to try the the various covenants as we build them, and we're going to build a solid foundation in which to be able to look at Jeremiah 31:31 and see the transition of Pentecost to the Feast of Weeks and the giving of the law and the giving of the Spirit and how God works, and then see that we can now have access. And this was what they did. I mean, this was Acts chapter 2. The Jews and Gentiles met together to study the apostles' teaching. There was no New Testament. So what were the apostles teaching? It was based on the Tanakh. It was based on what the expectation was and their experience with Jesus. Mm-hmm. And so it's unfortunate how many are trapped into the seminary and the pulpit theology, and then the Bible studies, which are all scripted for them by denominations that don't give them the freedom to say, I'm casting off all the shackles. I'm going to go read the unseen realm. I'm going to go read about the courtyards of heaven. I'm going to go read about how all this is interconnected, and I'm going to become a defender of the faith because I'm armed. You got a Christian Bible. I got that, and I got all of this too. And it is so convincing, and it makes you so enthusiastic that when you think about Ephesians 2 and God's admonition, you've lost your first love, I can look in the mirror and say, no, I haven't. I'm 25 years since I came to faith in the Lord. I've never been so on fire to pursue the truth and embrace outside of it, and to spend time with Edersheim and to spend time with other Jewish theologians who are giving commentary. Joe Shulam, who has written extraordinary, the Jewish view of the book of Acts, the Jewish view of the book of Romans, and go down those paths of extra biblical material that so magnifies it. And that's what you do. And I so appreciate what you do and always have. And that's made it so that it's easy for you and I to be friends, because we like this stuff.
Content is a powerful thing. It's wonderful to not have to make stuff up. Because
right.
There's so much there that it's like, why would I waste my time?
That's it.
There's just so much already there. That's such good stuff.
Well, we've run out of time, as we always do. There never seems to be enough time with you and I together, but hopefully the future will change that. And I will see you right back here next month. Mm-hmm. And we'll actually dig into these parables, because I think we can get through the three in one program. But this is kind of the setup to lead people into it and tease them into it to make sure that they tune back in again. Right back here on this third Monday of the month in the 12 o'clock hour with Dr. Michael Heiser. Watch the Naked Bible podcast. You will hear things that are life-changing. They are faith-changing. And you can find the links to all that at drmsh.com. He also has a couple of other projects that are, he travels to Texas to go film, and you'll get excited about those once you watch Fringe Pop one time. You'll enjoy that, and just open your mind. Open your mind to this unseen realm that in 2015, that I believe Michael Heiser blew the lid off and opened up. Minds were exploding at understanding how the unseen realm operates, and that will then open up your spirit to receive and discern. And I think it is a polishing cloth to the spirit of discernment that refines it to the point where you know what's an excuse, what's phony, and what's authentic. and there are so many opinions out there that wading through them becomes challenging, but I believe that filter that you have given me has become one that has been very discerning and has kept me on the straight and narrow. If it didn't for the first 19 years, at least it's done it for the last 6.
Well, I'm just glad it's useful. It's just, Scripture is a thing of wonder, as I say, and it's fun. It's fun to produce it. It's fun to learn as you go, and it's fun to hear how it has impacted people in a good way.
Well, you are a blessing to me, and I treasure the friendship, and God bless you and the family, and I will see you right back here this time next month.
Yep, thank you. You too.
All right, we're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll bring you the next edition of Revealing the Truth.